Well, I would like to start with a confession. This year, I have felt drawn towards anxiety like never before in my life. And it's not a big and loud anxiety. It's more like a low-grade fever, or like a little strained muscle in your back that you can kind of forget for a while, and then you just twist just the wrong way, and it just radiates through your whole body. I can be just humming along just fine, and then I'll catch a single headline. I'll notice a little news report, or I'll see a yard sign, or I'll watch a little video online, and suddenly I'm feeling it again. Just uptight and wound up and chewing on concerns like a dog on a bone. And I've spoken with a number of friends, and it is almost strange how many of them express feeling very similar things. As if anxiety were in the air around us, like mosquitoes, just always there buzzing and nibbling on our ears, distracting, whispering. It's COVID. It's quarantines. It's missing human touch, even in handshakes. It's loss and fear of loss. It's angry politics. It's race relations. It's riots, it's cancel culture, it's concern for the country we love, and so many other things. And anxiety, even in very subtle forms, always carries a double tragedy. Most often, it leaves us miserable, right? That's the obvious part. It steals our peace and joy, and leaves only a knot in our stomach in its place. But there's a second tragedy too. It narrows our field of vision. Psychologists tell us that when we're anxious, just about everything else begins to fade away and we become totally focused on what we perceive as threats. So what we see shrinks, and we're consumed with self-protection. My interests, my family, my small circle of concern, ever smaller. That is precisely the opposite of the kingdom of God. Kingdom life is expansive, it's wide, it's open hands, it's open hearts, it's open homes. You think of the father of the prodigal. He sees his son, he's still far away off, and yet he comes running out of his home, and his arms are wide. He calls out for his best robe. He kills the fatted calf so that all the neighbors can come to his home, into the home, to celebrate together. I think of Peter Mutabazi, who we're going to hear from in just a little bit. He spent 4 years as a child on the streets of Kampala, and yet today he's welcoming children from the U.S. foster system into his home. I think of a young man in my neighborhood right at the peak of the COVID crisis when everyone was hunkering down. He was out driving around from store to store trying to get hand sanitizer and groceries and very precious toilet paper for senior citizens in the neighborhood. I think of Jason Johnson on the CAFO team, how he and his family have welcomed in a young woman in the foster system and her newborn baby. And even after she aged out of the system, they continued to invite her to live with them. Anxious thoughts make us very different than that. It looks much more like a miser, huddled over his gold, crouched, defensive, tight-fisted. So here is our question. Amidst all that pulls our thoughts inward and small, how do we live as people with open hands, open hearts? How do we be people of calm? In a word, how do we live as people of peace in an age of anxiety? Well, ultimately, I believe this is a very spiritual question. And so if we're not willing to address spiritual matters, we will not get to the deepest parts of it. But I also do not believe that God calls us to race past the more physical, obvious aspects of this as we address the issue of anxiety. God made us both physical and spiritual beings. Our minds, our intellects, our hearts, our bodies, even our relationships with others, these things are all intertwined in ways that science is only beginning to understand. And God cares about all of these things. You think of Elijah, the prophet. And he's just won this great victory over the prophets of Baal. He's run down the mountain in front of Ahab's chariot in the storm and rain. But then the high begins to wear off. He's exhausted. He hears that Jezebel is out for his blood, so he flees into the desert. He crashes under a broom tree. And what he says there to God is thick with anxiety and depression. He says, I have had enough. I quit. I'm a failure. Just let me die. And remarkably, God doesn't initially address him with a spiritual truth. Not at first. He simply allows Elijah to sleep. Then he feeds him a good meal. Then he lets him sleep again. And only after this does he begin to remind him of truth that Elijah knew all along. So in addressing anxiety, I think we are well to start where God started, with those physical, tangible things like sleep. So if we're staying up late, watching Netflix or working, just creating basic patterns of regular sleep can make a huge difference. I know it does for me. Or you think about physical activity. I used to think that for exercise to count, you really had to make yourself miserable. But what study after study are now showing is that small changes in our level of physical activity can make a huge difference in our anxiety levels, for both good and for ill. One fascinating study, actually, the scientists had these healthy 20-somethings live a more sedentary lifestyle, so they could do what they were normally doing. They just had to sit in their couch a lot more. And after just 1 week, these young people were already having measurably higher levels of anxiety and depressive thoughts. But the opposite is true too. More and more studies are showing that just small increases in our physical activity, like adding 20 or 30 minutes of walking a day, can dramatically decrease our levels of anxiety. Well, we could talk about a lot of different of these physical things, everything from how just 10 minutes out in nature can literally lower our blood pressure, or how incredibly important it is just to spend time with other human beings and how that affects both our minds, but even our physical bodies. Let's talk about just one more thing. Our relationship with screens and media. Study after study are showing that as screen time increases, anxiety increases with it. It is truly remarkable how that happens. I know for myself, just watching one news clip can literally make me feel like I've stuck my finger in a light socket. And it robs our calm and peace, and yet we keep coming back. I think for that little jolt of adrenaline that it gives us, that little stimulation. Perhaps we can wrestle with whether we could cut the frequency of our news checks while still remaining informed and engaged citizens. Well, all of these little habits, these little choices, from sleep to physical activity to media consumption, they can make a profound difference, reducing the buzz of those mosquitoes in our ear, maybe even their bite. But at the same time, I think we'll always find there is something deeper as well. As humans, true health, it rises from the deep down places. What's happening on the surface is always springing up from somewhere below. That's why Jesus always talked about trees bearing good fruit when they were healthy down below. If our hearts are restless and anxious, then the surface of our lives ultimately will be as well. St. Augustine expressed it so very well. O Lord, you have made us for thyself, and we are restless until we find our rest in thee. And of course, part of this, St. Augustine knew, was simply a matter of being reminded of truth. We are forgetful creatures. We must be reminded every day of what is most true. And perhaps more precisely, God's truth must become the biggest, truest truth in our hearts. My friends, if we are Christians, even if we have prayed the prayer and we're going to be in heaven someday, if the biggest, loudest truth in our thought life is that this life is what matters most, if our identity hinges upon what we accomplish and what we own, if we believe that we can have security in our bank account or a 401k, if those things are the loudest truths in our lives, then all that matters most is precarious indeed. As we have learned, this year can be lost in an instant. We have good reason for anxiety. But if what is most true is that God is the creator of heaven and earth, that he has all of history in his hands, including us, and that our core identity is not in what we can accomplish or own, but in simply being his beloved sons and daughters before we've achieved anything, and that he will ultimately set all things right, and that even now we can join him in that work. If those things are the truest truth in our thoughts, then we can say, what can man do? What can disease do? What can separate us from the love of God? Nothing. There is one thing more, because I think we've all experienced the challenge of knowing something to be true up here and yet still not feeling it here. What do we do with that? Well, here is something significant. Anxiety is contagious. It can spill from one heart to another, perhaps across entire societies. One fascinating study in British Columbia in 2016 actually found that in classrooms where the teacher was anxious and overwhelmed, the students actually measured higher levels of cortisol, stress hormone, in their blood. Anxiety is contagious. But if anxiety is contagious, so is calm. Maybe you've experienced that. You're in a situation where everything is chaotic and things are falling apart, but there's one person who remains calm, confident, and somehow that calm just spills into every other heart in the room. Nowhere is this contagious calm more beautiful than between a mother and her child. When a mother and child lock eyes, when they're smiling back and forth, making sounds back and forth, their hearts literally begin to beat in sync with one another. The baby's much faster heart slows and comes to beat in rhythm with its mother's calm heart, often within milliseconds of one another. And I believe that that is God's invitation to us as well, to step out of the noise and craze of life regularly, every day, multiple times a day, simply to allow our heart to begin to beat in rhythm with his heart, which is always calm. There are many ways to do this, certainly, but I'd like to share just one that's been very meaningful to me personally, a small daily rhythm. Every evening, about 30 minutes, every evening, 30 minutes before I go to bed, I will turn my phone onto airplane mode. And I don't put it in my room, I put it in our office to charge. And that way, the final thoughts of my day are not shaped by a news feed or angry politics or a frantic work email, but my heart can begin to slow, my thoughts slow. I can be fully present to my wife, Rachel, and then we can sleep. And in the morning, I get up, I get a cup of coffee, and I do not turn my phone back on until after I've spent time in the presence of our good Father. Spend time in Scripture being reminded of what is most deeply true. I like to express thankfulness to him in words, sometimes writing that in my journal, and lifting up the day to him and anything else that concerns me in prayer. And only after that will I turn my phone back on. Sometimes immediately afterwards, sometimes after breakfast with the kids, so that I can be more emotionally present to them. And increasingly, I've actually been trying to push that out a bit further so I can spend the first 1 to 2 hours a day in very focused, effective, deep work. Now, this is a very small thing in many ways. I mean, it won't accomplish virtually anything on its own. It won't even be seen by really anyone except for my family. And yet I have come to believe that this small choice, repeated day after day, may have more impact ultimately on the man that I'm becoming, and maybe even the impact that I have in other lives, than virtually any other decision, these big decisions that seem so important. I believe with all my heart that God uses small daily decisions to shape us and to impact others. After all, he is the God of the mustard seed. He sees even the little glass of water offered to a child, and he honors even those 2 pennies dropped into the offering plate. And he can multiply even a little lunchbox of loaves and fish, enough to feed a multitude. And knowing this frees us. It lightens our load. It releases us from strain and from those things that just are too large for us. We don't need to sweat the big stuff. We can simply give ourselves fully to the small invitations of love and faithfulness. And as we do, our hearts begin to beat in rhythm with the heart of our good Father, a heart that is always calm. And we can keep open hearts and open hands and open homes, sharing a contagious calm in a world that so badly needs it, living as people of peace in an age of anxiety.